It's 4:47 a.m. There's frost on the inside of your window. Because you don't have glass, you have a piece of oiled linen stretched over a hole in the wall. Your feet hit a dirt floor, not tile, not wood, dirt, packed hard by 1,000 footsteps, mixed with straw, and, if you're being honest, animal manure, because your ox sleeps in the room next to you. Literally next to you, sometimes in the same room as you. You haven't showered. You won't shower today. You probably won't shower this month. Welcome to medieval Europe, somewhere between 1200 and 1400 AD. And here's the thing nobody tells you in the history books. This wasn't the romantic version, with knights and castles and flowing banquets. That world existed for about 1% of the population. For the other 99% of human beings alive during this era, life looked something like what you're about to see. And by the end of this video, I promise you'll never romanticize the good old days again, because there's a secret waiting near the middle of this video about exactly how peasants were legally not allowed to leave their own village, and what happened to the ones who tried. Stick around for that. Let's start the clock. This is a single day, sunrise to sunset, in the life of a medieval peasant, and I want you to ask yourself, honestly, at every single stage, could you actually survive this? There's no alarm clock in the 13th century. There doesn't need to be. The rooster does the job, and so does something far crueler, daylight itself. Medieval peasant life was governed entirely by the sun, because candles and oil lamps were expensive luxuries that most families used sparingly, if at all. Beeswax candles? Forget it. Those were for the church and the nobility. A peasant family burned rushlights, which were literally reeds dipped in animal fat that produced a dim, smoky, stinking flame that burned out in about 20 minutes. So when the sun set, you basically stopped functioning, and when the sun rose, you were expected to already be moving. You get up in what you slept in, because most peasants didn't own pajamas or even a dedicated set of sleep clothes. You slept in your undergarments, maybe the same linen shirt you'd wear the next day, on a straw-filled mattress, laid on a wooden frame, if you were lucky enough to have a frame at all. Many peasant families just slept on the floor, all together, for warmth. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents. One room, one fire, one shared heat source, because firewood, like candles, wasn't free. It had to be gathered, and in many regions, gathering wood from the wrong forest was illegal. That's right. The forests weren't public property. They belonged to the Lord, and poaching wood, or worse, poaching game, could get you fined, flogged, or maimed. Now here's where the 1% versus 99% gap starts to show itself immediately, before you've even eaten breakfast. While you are waking up on a dirt floor next to your livestock, the lord of the manor, maybe half a mile away in his stone hall, is waking up in an actual bed, with a feather mattress, wool blankets, and servants already stoking a fire that's been burning all night. He has glass in some of his windows. He has meat waiting for him. He has, quite literally, an entire class of people, you, whose sole purpose, as far as the feudal system is concerned, is to make his life comfortable. This isn't a metaphor. This is the literal legal structure of feudalism. You are tied to land you don't own, farming crops that aren't fully yours, to pay rent to a man you didn't choose, in a system you were born into, and, in most cases, could never escape. And that's the first curiosity loop I want to plant. Later in this video, we're going to talk about exactly how much of your harvest, as a percentage, actually belonged to you. The number is going to make you angry. Stick with me. Breakfast, if it exists at all, is fast and joyless. Pottage, a thick, boiled mixture of grains, peas, beans, and whatever vegetables happen to be in season, sometimes with a scrap of bacon fat for flavor, is the backbone of the peasant diet. You eat it out of a wooden bowl, maybe a trencher, stale bread used as a plate, with your hands, or a simple wooden spoon. Forks don't really exist yet in most of Europe. They're considered borderline sinful. an unnecessary Italian affectation that won't catch on widely for centuries. Meat is rare, extremely rare. Most peasants might eat meat a few times a month, if that, usually on feast days tied to the church calendar. The rest of the time, it's bread, grains, and vegetables, and the bread itself is often coarse, dense, and mixed with whatever filler was available in lean years, including, in genuine famine conditions, ground bark or even ground-up straw to stretch the flour supply. Bad harvest years didn't mean tighten the belt. They meant people died. Starvation wasn't a distant historical concept. It was a recurring, seasonal threat that stalked every single peasant family, every single year, depending on rain, frost, and the whims of weather nobody could predict or control. Meanwhile, and I want you to really sit with this contrast, the Lord's table that same morning might include fresh bread made from fine white flour, a luxury since white bread required extensively sifted grain that took far more labor to produce, eggs, cured meats, ale or wine, and imported spices like pepper or cinnamon that had traveled thousands of miles along trade routes, costing more per ounce than gold in some cases. That's the 1% versus the 99%, laid out in something as simple as breakfast. You are quite literally growing the wheat that becomes the Lord's fine white bread, while you eat the coarse leftover grain, mixed with beans, in a boiled slop. Now the real day begins. And this is where I need you to understand something that modern life has completely erased from our collective memory. Manual agricultural labor, done from dawn to dusk, 6 days a week, for your entire life, from around age 7 until you physically could not stand up anymore, is one of the most brutal, body-destroying regimens a human being can endure. You walk to the fields, barefoot or in simple leather shoes that offered almost no support, carrying tools that you or the local blacksmith made by hand, wooden plows tipped with iron, scythes, sickles, hoes. If it's plowing season, you're walking behind an ox or a team of oxen for literally hours, guiding a heavy wooden plow through thick, wet, root-tangled soil, using your entire body weight to keep the blade steady in the earth. Your hands blister, then they callous, then they crack open again anyway, because callus only protects you so much when you're gripping wet wood in the cold for 10 hours straight. If it's harvest season, you're bent double for hours at a time, swinging a scythe or cutting stalks with a sickle, and this is not an exaggeration. Skeletal remains from medieval peasant burial sites show severe, early-onset arthritis, spinal compression, and joint degeneration that we would today associate with people in their 70s and 80s, except these skeletons belong to people in their 20s and 30s. Bioarchaeologists studying medieval English peasant remains have found that by their 30s, many agricultural laborers already had the joint wear of people 50 years older today. Bent spines, collapsed vertebrae, osteoarthritis in the knees, hips, and lower back so severe it would be classified as a disability today. And you did this labor on a caloric intake that, by modern nutritional standards, would be considered borderline inadequate for the physical output required, meaning peasants were often simultaneously overworked and undernourished, a combination that ages the human body at a terrifying rate. There is no modern equivalent to this, not construction work, not competitive athletics, because those come with rest days, medical care, proper nutrition, and an end date. Medieval field labor had none of those things. It was daily, decade after decade, with no retirement, because you worked until your body simply gave out, and then, if you had no children to support you, you likely starved or begged, because there was no social safety net, no pension, no disability insurance, nothing. Now, and here's curiosity loop number 2. Later in this video, I'm going to tell you about the single most physically demanding medieval job that wasn't farming, and it involves something so unglamorous and disgusting that you've probably never even considered it existed. It made grave diggers rich. Keep that in mind. Around midday, if you're a peasant, you might get a short break. Bread, maybe some cheese or ale, eaten right there in the field, because walking home and back would waste working daylight, and daylight is the only currency you actually have enough of. Ale, by the way, wasn't for getting drunk. It was often safer to drink than water, since brewing killed off many waterborne pathogens, even though nobody understood why at the time. They just knew that villages, where people drank ale instead of untreated water, tended to have fewer people keeling over from dysentery. Meanwhile, back at the manor house, the lord and his family are sitting down to a formal midday meal that might last an hour or more, served by staff, featuring multiple courses, meat, wine, and often entertainment. A musician, a traveling storyteller, sometimes even trained animals for amusement. This is the core of the 1% versus 99% reality of medieval life that modern media constantly gets wrong. We picture medieval society as knights and castles because that's the version that got recorded, painted, and passed down. Because the nobility were the only ones who could afford art, chroniclers, and preserved manuscripts. The 99% left almost no written record of their own lives at all. Historians have had to reconstruct peasant existence from tax rolls, church records, court documents, and, increasingly, archaeological and skeletal evidence, precisely because peasants themselves rarely knew how to read or write, and had neither the time nor resources to record their own stories. Let that sink in. The version of medieval history you grew up with is disproportionately the story of 1% of the population, simply because they're the only ones who left records. The actual medieval experience, the one lived by the overwhelming majority of human beings during this 300-year stretch, was one of grinding labor, chronic hunger, and profound physical suffering, largely erased from popular memory. Let's talk about what happens when you get sick. Not if, when. Because in the medieval world, getting sick wasn't a minor inconvenience you shrugged off with painkillers and a day of rest. It was a roll of the dice, with your life on the table and the doctors available to you, if you could even access one, which most peasants couldn't, operated on a medical framework that had almost nothing to do with actual biology. The dominant medical theory of the era was humorism, the idea that the human body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that disease was caused by an imbalance between them. This theory, inherited from ancient Greek medicine and barely updated in over 1,000 years, meant that the standard treatment for almost any ailment was bloodletting, deliberately cutting you open or applying leeches to drain out what they believed was excess blood. Got a fever? Bloodletting. Got an infection? Bloodletting. Broke a bone and it's swelling? Bloodletting. This wasn't some fringe quack practice. This was mainstream, respected medical treatment, performed by barbers as often as by physicians, because barber surgeons handled both haircuts and surgery, which is exactly as terrifying as it sounds. The red and white striped barber pole you still see outside barbershops today, that's a direct visual descendant of the bloody rags and bandages barbers used to display outside their shops, advertising their surgical services alongside shaves and haircuts. And here's the part that should really unsettle you. There was no understanding of germs. None. Louis Pasteur's germ theory of disease wouldn't exist for another 500 years. So when a surgeon operated on you, say, to amputate a crushed limb after a farming accident, which happened constantly given how dangerous scythes, plows, and millstones were, he wasn't sterilizing his instruments, because the concept of sterilization didn't exist. He was using the same knife on you that he'd used on the last patient, and the one before that, wiping it, if he wiped it at all, on his own clothing. Anesthesia was essentially non-existent, If you needed a limb amputated, you were held down by several strong men while it was sawed off, fully conscious, perhaps given alcohol or a sponge soaked in opium and herbs if you were fortunate enough to have access to one, which most peasants absolutely did not. Survival rates for major surgery were grim, and death from post-operative infection, given the complete absence of antiseptic practice, was extremely common. You could survive the amputation itself and still die a slow, agonizing death from infection days or weeks later. Childbirth deserves its own mention here, because it might be the single most dangerous, everyday event in medieval life. Maternal mortality rates were staggeringly high compared to today. Historians estimate that a significant percentage of women died during or shortly after childbirth at some point across their reproductive years from hemorrhage, infection, or complications with no surgical intervention available. There were no C-sections in any survivable form. If a baby was positioned wrong or too large, both mother and child frequently died, with midwives, skilled as many of them were within the limits of their knowledge, having no real tools to intervene beyond herbal remedies, prayer, and manual repositioning. Infant and child mortality was equally brutal. Historians estimate that in many medieval populations, something close to a third to a half of all children died before reaching adulthood, from disease, malnutrition, accidents, or infections that today would be treated with a single course of antibiotics. Something as simple as a scraped knee that got infected or a childhood fever could, and regularly did, kill. This is the world you woke up into this morning. No aspirin, no antibiotics, no vaccines, no anesthesia worth the name, no germ theory, just herbs, prayer, leeches, and hope. And now, curiosity loop number 3. And this one's a big one. I need to tell you about the disease that didn't just kill individuals, but came within a hair's breadth of ending medieval civilization entirely. We're getting to it in the next section, and once you understand the scale of it, you will never look at a flea, a rat, or a cough the same way again. Back to our day. It's early afternoon now. The sun is high. You've had maybe 20 minutes of rest, and you're back bent over your crops, or tending livestock, or repairing a fence, or hauling water from the village well in heavy wooden buckets that you carry on a yoke across your shoulders, a task usually assigned to women and children, and one that could easily rack up several miles of walking per day just to keep a household supplied with water for cooking, cleaning, and livestock. Sanitation, or the near-total absence of it, deserves its own spotlight here, because it directly connects to why disease spread so catastrophically in this era. Most peasant villages had no sewage system whatsoever. Waste went into cesspits, or directly into the same rivers and streams that supplied drinking water downstream. Animal waste mixed with human waste, mixed with agricultural runoff, often within feet of the well everyone drank from. Nobody understood the connection between contaminated water and disease. That link wouldn't be scientifically established until the 1800s, so villages would experience recurring outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and other waterborne illnesses without ever understanding why, attributing it instead to bad air, astrological alignments, or divine punishment for sin. And this is the perfect moment to widen the lens back out to the 1% versus 99% divide, because sanitation was one of the starkest class divides of all. The Lord's Manor might have a garderobe, a primitive form of toilet that emptied into a moat or pit below, offering at least some separation from living space. Larger monasteries had genuinely sophisticated water and waste systems, some of which rerouted fresh streams specifically for washing and drainage. But your average peasant home? A shared outdoor pit, or in poorer, denser settlements, waste simply thrown into the street, where it sat, attracting flies, vermin, and disease, until rain washed it away or it decomposed into the ground. Combine this with peasants living in close, cramped, poorly ventilated homes, often sharing living space directly with livestock, chickens, pigs, sometimes a cow or goat brought inside during winter for warmth and protection from thieves, and you have an environment that is, from a modern public health perspective, an absolute nightmare. Livestock in close quarters with humans doesn't just mean bad smells. It means a constant exchange of pathogens between species, a documented driver of numerous disease outbreaks throughout history, including, many researchers believe, influenza strains that likely originated from exactly these kinds of close human-animal living arrangements. This is the environment: overcrowded, undersanitary, malnourished, physically exhausted, living alongside livestock, drinking from potentially contaminated water sources, completely lacking any germ theory, antibiotics, or effective medical intervention. Now imagine dropping the most devastating pandemic in recorded human history into that exact environment. In October 1347, a fleet of trading ships arrived at the port of Messina in Sicily. When the ships docked, most of the sailors aboard were already dead. The few who remained alive were covered in strange black boils that oozed blood and pus, and they, too, would be dead within days. This was the beginning of the most catastrophic disease outbreak in recorded human history, the Black Death, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, most commonly transmitted through the bites of fleas that lived on black rats, rats that traveled constantly and invisibly aboard merchant ships and trade caravans along routes stretching all the way back to Central Asia. Within about 5 years, from 1347 to roughly 1351, the Black Death is estimated by historians to have killed somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population. Let that number actually land, not 30 to 60% of the sick, 30 to 60% of everyone. Entire villages were wiped out so completely that some disappeared from historical record entirely, their names surviving only in old tax documents, referencing settlements that simply ceased to exist because there was no one left alive to inhabit them. The disease manifested primarily in 3 horrifying forms. Bubonic plague, the most common form, caused those infamous swollen, blackened lymph nodes, the buboes the disease is named for, typically in the groin, armpits, or neck, accompanied by fever, chills, and vomiting, with death often occurring within a week for those who didn't survive. Septicemic plague infected the bloodstream directly, sometimes killing victims within a single day, occasionally before other symptoms even had time to appear. And pneumonic plague, the most contagious and lethal form, attacked the lungs, spread through airborne respiratory droplets between people rather than requiring flea bites at all, and killed nearly everyone it infected, often within 24 to 48 hours of symptom onset. For a medieval peasant, understand what this actually meant on a lived, daily level. You wake up, your neighbor was healthy yesterday. Today they have a fever and swollen lumps in their armpit. By tomorrow, they're dead. The day after, their spouse has the same symptoms. Within a week, half your village is gone, and there is no explanation anyone can give you that makes sense, because nobody understands bacteria. Nobody understands that fleas on rats are the vector, and the leading medical theories of the time blamed miasma, bad, corrupted air, or divine punishment for humanity's sins, or, in a wave of horrific and unjust scapegoating across parts of Europe, blamed minority religious communities, leading to devastating persecution and violence against Jewish communities in particular, based entirely on baseless conspiracy theories about well poisoning. Physicians of the era, utterly helpless against a disease they didn't understand, developed the now iconic plague doctor costume, the long leather coat, the wide-brimmed hat, and most famously, the beak-shaped mask stuffed with dried flowers, herbs, and spices, worn because doctors believed foul miasma caused the disease, and that breathing through sweet-smelling substances might filter out the corrupted air. It did essentially nothing to protect them, because the actual cause, bacteria transmitted through flea bites and respiratory droplets, had nothing to do with smell at all. Many plague doctors died of the very disease they were trying to treat, which tells you everything about how little medieval medicine could actually offer against it. Now here's where the 1% versus 99% divide becomes almost unbearably stark, and it's a detail that gets left out of most popular retellings. The wealthy had an escape option, the peasantry simply did not. Nobles, wealthy merchants, and clergy with resources could flee to isolated country estates, quarantine themselves away from population centers, and dramatically reduce their exposure by simply removing themselves from crowded, disease-ridden towns and villages. The wealthy Florentine narrator device in Boccaccio's The Decameron, written in the direct aftermath of the plague, depicts exactly this. A group of wealthy young nobles who escape Florence to a country villa, passing their quarantine, telling each other stories, safely removed from the horror unfolding in the city they left behind. Peasants had no such option. You couldn't abandon your fields. Abandoning your labor meant starvation for your entire family, plague or no plague. You couldn't simply relocate to an isolated countryside estate because you didn't own an isolated countryside estate. You were often legally bound to the land you worked, under a system called serfdom, meaning you needed your lord's explicit permission to leave the manor at all, plague be damned. So while the wealthy could isolate, wait it out, and return once the worst had passed, peasants remained trapped in exactly the crowded, unsanitary, close-contact conditions that allowed the disease to spread fastest, with nowhere to go and no legal right to leave even if they'd wanted to. And this is exactly the secret I promised you earlier in the video, the legal reality of serfdom. Under manorial law, across much of medieval Europe, peasants classified as serfs were not free citizens in any modern sense. They were legally bound to the manor and its lord, generation after generation. A serf who fled the manor without permission could be legally hunted down and forcibly returned, sometimes branded or physically punished as a deterrent to others. In parts of medieval England, if a serf managed to escape to a chartered town and survive there, unclaimed, for a year and a day, custom held that they could earn their freedom, which tells you just how difficult and rare successful escape actually was, since the entire system was built around preventing exactly that outcome. The lord needed your labor to generate income from the land. Losing serfs meant losing revenue, so manorial courts and local law enforcement actively worked to track down and return escaped serfs, treating human beings as a form of legally bound labor stock, tied to their birth village for essentially their entire lives, plague or no plague, hardship or no hardship. So when the Black Death tore through Europe, it did not affect all classes equally, despite disease theoretically not caring about social rank. The wealthy had options: flee, isolate, wait it out on private estates with private food stores. The peasantry had almost none of those options. They were bound to the land, packed into crowded, unsanitary villages, malnourished from years of grinding poverty, and physically weakened by decades of brutal labor, all factors that made them significantly more vulnerable to a fast-spreading, poorly understood, and almost universally lethal disease. Here's a strange historical twist, though, and it's worth mentioning because it's genuinely fascinating. In the plague's horrific aftermath, the sheer scale of the death toll actually shifted the economic balance of power, at least temporarily. With somewhere between a third and well over half of the workforce suddenly gone, surviving peasants and laborers found themselves in a position of unprecedented leverage. Labor was now scarce, and lords desperately needed workers to farm their land, leading in many regions to rising wages, the erosion of some of the harshest serfdom restrictions, and a gradual, uneven weakening of the rigid feudal structure that had dominated Europe for centuries. It's a brutal irony of history. One of the deadliest events ever recorded also became, indirectly, one of the catalysts that began cracking apart the very system that had kept the 99% in such total, generational subjugation. But that's centuries of slow change. On the actual day we're walking through, during an active outbreak, none of that mattered yet. What mattered was survival, and the odds were not in your favor. Let's return to our single day, because even without an active plague outbreak, the day itself isn't close to over. As the sun begins its descent, field labor doesn't simply stop. Livestock need tending, cows milked, pigs fed, chickens gathered in before nightfall predators come looking. Tools need cleaning and storing. If it's harvest season, grain needs threshing, beating stalks against a hard surface to separate the edible grain from the inedible chaff. A repetitive, exhausting task, often done by hand, with a wooden flail, well into the evening hours. Women in peasant households, contrary to some modern assumptions, worked just as brutally hard as men, simply in different, and often overlapping, domains. Alongside fieldwork during planting and harvest seasons, women were typically responsible for cooking, brewing ale, spinning wool and flax into thread, weaving cloth, making and mending clothing, tending gardens, caring for children, and managing the household's food preservation, salting, smoking, or drying meat and vegetables to survive the winter months when fresh food became scarce or non-existent. The medieval peasant household ran on an almost unimaginable volume of unpaid, physically demanding domestic labor, stacked directly on top of agricultural work, with essentially zero modern conveniences to reduce the burden. No washing machines, no running water, no refrigeration. Every single task that a modern kitchen appliance now handles in minutes took hours of direct physical effort. Children, too, were expected to contribute from a strikingly young age. By around age 6 or 7, children in peasant families were typically already doing meaningful chores, scaring birds away from planted seeds, fetching water, gathering firewood, tending smaller livestock, or helping with lighter harvest tasks. Childhood, in the modern sense of a protected period of play and education, essentially didn't exist for the 99%. It existed, again, primarily for the children of the wealthy, who might have access to a tutor, formal education, or apprenticeship into a respected trade or clergy position. Paths almost entirely closed off to peasant children, who were expected to become the next generation of agricultural laborers, following their parents into exactly the same grinding cycle, generation after generation, with almost no chance of social or economic mobility. By the time the sun fully sets, you've worked somewhere between 12 and 16 hours, depending on the season. Medieval labor was intensely tied to daylight hours, meaning summer workdays were brutally long, while winter workdays shrank, though winter brought its own separate hardships of cold, food scarcity, and disease. You eat a final, simple meal, likely more pottage, maybe bread, by the dim, smoky light of a rushlight or the glow of the hearth fire, because burning candles all evening simply wasn't affordable. And then you sleep, on straw, on the floor, or a simple wooden bed frame if you're fortunate, beside your family, possibly beside your livestock, in the same clothes you wore all day, because a full change of clothing was, for many peasant families, a genuine luxury rather than an assumed daily habit. Tomorrow, you do it again, and the day after, and the day after that. For your entire life, barring illness, injury, or an outbreak of a disease with no cure, no explanation, and, if it's the Black Death sweeping through your region, potentially no mercy at all. Let's zoom all the way out now and put the entire day side by side. because this contrast is really the emotional core of everything we've covered. While you, the peasant, were waking before dawn on a dirt floor, eating boiled grain slop, walking miles behind an ox with a wooden plow, developing arthritis in your 20s, drinking water that might carry dysentery, and living in daily proximity to a disease that could kill 60% of your entire region within months, the lord of your manor was waking in a real bed, eating fine bread and meat prepared by servants, discussing politics or hunting plans over a formal midday meal, possibly reading something the vast majority of peasants never learned to do, since literacy was overwhelmingly concentrated among clergy and nobility, and retreating each evening to a private chamber warmed by a fire someone else had to gather and chop wood for. The lord's wealth, status, and comfort were not incidental. They existed because of the peasant's labor. The entire feudal economic structure was built on the principle that peasants worked the land, paid rent or tribute, often called dues or rents, sometimes paid in crops, sometimes in required labor days on the lord's own private fields, called demesne land, and the surplus generated by that labor flowed upward, funding the castles, the armor, the feasts, the art, and the leisure time that we now associate with medieval life in popular imagination, precisely because that's the version of medieval life that got recorded, painted, and preserved. The 99% built medieval civilization with their bodies. The 1% got to enjoy it, and, crucially, got to write its history. So let's answer the question in the title honestly. Why wouldn't you last a day as a medieval peasant? It's not just the physical labor, although that alone would break most modern bodies within a matter of weeks, let alone a lifetime. It's not just the disease, or the lack of medicine, or the ever-present threat of a pandemic capable of killing more than half the people you've ever known. It's the complete and total absence of choice, options, or escape. You couldn't quit your job. You couldn't easily move to a new village. You couldn't access modern medicine because it didn't exist yet, and even the primitive medicine available was frequently more dangerous than the illness itself. You couldn't guarantee your children would survive childhood. You couldn't guarantee you'd survive childbirth, or a bad harvest, or a passing outbreak of a disease nobody understood. Every single safety net that modern life provides, however imperfect, however unevenly distributed even today, simply did not exist for the medieval 99%. No antibiotics, no sanitation systems, no labor laws, no minimum wage, no legal right to leave your circumstances, no germ theory to even explain why people were dying. Just relentless, back-breaking labor, minimal food, chronic disease exposure, and a rigid social hierarchy explicitly designed to keep you exactly where you were born, for the benefit of a tiny fraction of the population who lived an almost entirely different existence, often less than a mile away. We look back on medieval times and think castles, knights, and romance, because that's the surviving aesthetic, the art, the architecture, the illuminated manuscripts, the grand cathedrals. But underneath every single one of those castles was a system of forced agricultural labor, and underneath every cathedral's stonework were the calloused, cracked, arthritic hands of the 99% who built it, farmed the food that fed the workers who built it, and paid the taxes that funded it, while living, dying, and being buried in almost complete historical silence. That's the filthy truth. Not filthy in the sense of dirt on the floor, although there was plenty of that too. Filthy in the sense of a system built on such staggering, invisible inequality that we've spent 700 years since romanticizing the 1%, while the 99% simply vanished from memory, buried, unnamed, in mass graves during outbreaks or in unmarked plots beside the very fields they broke their bodies farming. Let's rewind to that first moment of the morning again, because I skipped over something worth its own spotlight: what you're actually wearing. For the average peasant, clothing wasn't a form of expression, it was pure function, and it was scarce. Most peasants owned perhaps 2 or 3 outfits in their entire lifetime, not 2 or 3 outfits per season. A basic tunic made of wool or coarse linen, dyed with whatever cheap, locally available plant dye was on hand, woad for blue, madder for red, weld for yellow, because vibrant, consistent dyes were expensive and heavily associated with wealth. In fact, in many regions, sumptuary laws existed specifically to legally restrict what colors and fabrics peasants were even permitted to wear, regardless of whether they could somehow afford better. Bright scarlet, certain furs, and fine silks were reserved by law for nobility and the wealthy merchant class. A peasant caught wearing above their station could actually face legal penalties, a stunning detail that reveals just how deliberately the class divide was built into everyday life, down to the literal color of your shirt. Shoes, if you had them, were simple leather, often poorly fitted, offering minimal support and even less protection from cold or wet. Many peasant children went barefoot for much of the year simply because replacing worn-out shoes was expensive, and growing feet made investment in proper footwear impractical. Washing clothes was infrequent and laborious. No washing machines, obviously, but also often no soap in the way we understand it today. Lye soap, when available, was harsh, homemade, and used sparingly. Clothes were more often aired out, brushed, and mended repeatedly rather than washed regularly, meaning that yes, the persistent smell of unwashed wool, sweat, and wood smoke was simply the ambient scent of peasant life, day in and day out. Compare that to the nobility, whose wardrobes might include multiple outfits made of imported silk, fine wool, embroidered with gold or silver thread, dyed in expensive, vivid colors, using imported dyes like Tyrian purple or genuine saffron-based yellows, with fur trim from ermine or sable, fabrics and colors that were, again, often legally reserved for their class alone. Clothing wasn't just comfort, it was a walking, visible declaration of exactly where you sat in the social hierarchy, and the law made absolutely sure that declaration couldn't be faked. Let's go back to water, because I only touched on it briefly, and it deserves more attention, because water access was one of the most physically demanding, time-consuming, and dangerous parts of daily peasant life. The village well, or in some regions a nearby stream or river, was the sole water source for an entire community, drinking, cooking, washing, watering animals, and irrigating small kitchen gardens. Multiple times a day, someone in the household, usually women or children, walked to the well or river, filled heavy wooden or clay vessels, and carried them back, often balanced on a yoke across the shoulders, a task that could easily total several miles of walking daily, depending on the well's distance from the home. This wasn't a minor chore. Carrying water was physically exhausting, repetitive labor that added significant hours to an already brutal workday, and it carried genuine health risk. Wells and rivers were shared with livestock, agricultural runoff, and, in poorly managed villages, proximity to waste disposal areas, meaning contamination was a constant, invisible threat. Outbreaks of dysentery, cholera-like illnesses, and typhoid were directly tied to contaminated water sources, but without any understanding of microbiology, villagers had no reliable way to identify which water sources were dangerous until people started getting sick, and by then it was often too late to prevent wider spread. The wealthy, once again, had meaningful insulation from this risk. Larger manors and monasteries frequently had access to protected wells, dedicated water systems, or the resources to boil water for cooking and brewing consistently, while the peasant household's water access remained a daily gamble, dependent entirely on the cleanliness of a shared, unregulated communal resource. I mentioned bloodletting earlier, but I want to go deeper here because some of the specific treatments medieval medicine offered are almost impossible to believe today, and they perfectly illustrate why getting sick as a peasant was such a terrifying gamble. Trepanning, the practice of drilling or scraping a hole directly into a living patient's skull, was used to treat everything from severe headaches to epilepsy to what we would now recognize as mental illness, based on the belief that this would release trapped evil spirits or pressure believed to be causing the affliction. Remarkably, archaeological evidence shows some patients actually survived this procedure, with skull bone showing signs of healing around the hole. But survival didn't mean the underlying problem was solved, and the procedure itself, performed without anesthesia or any concept of infection control, carried enormous risk of death from shock, blood loss, or subsequent infection. Mercury, arsenic, and lead were used in various forms as treatments for a range of ailments, from skin conditions to what were believed to be purifying tonics, substances we now know to be severely toxic, meaning some medieval patients were essentially being slowly poisoned by the very treatment meant to save them. Dentistry, meanwhile, deserves special mention because it might be one of the most universally dreaded aspects of medieval daily life. There were no dentists in the modern sense. Tooth extraction was typically performed by barber surgeons or even blacksmiths, using crude metal pliers, with zero anesthesia beyond perhaps alcohol or herbal sedatives, and zero antiseptic practice. Dental disease, given the era's diet, heavy on coarse bread, but also, for those who could afford it, increasingly available sugar imported from trade routes, was extremely common, and archaeological remains show widespread evidence of dental abscesses, severe decay, and jaw infections that, left untreated, could actually become fatal, since an infection in the jaw or facial area could spread to the bloodstream or brain with no antibiotics available. Toothaches that we'd resolve today with a single dental visit and a course of antibiotics could, in the medieval world, genuinely kill you. Let that sink in the next time you complain about a dentist appointment. The 1% versus 99% divide didn't stop at food, medicine, or clothing. It extended directly into the legal system itself. Peasants were typically subject to manor courts, presided over by the lord or his appointed steward, handling everything from property disputes between villagers to enforcement of labor obligations, fines for violations of local customs, and minor criminal matters. These courts were not independent, impartial bodies in any modern sense. The lord who judged your case was very often the same lord who profited directly from your labor and your fines, creating an obvious and largely unchecked conflict of interest. Punishments for peasants convicted of crimes could include fines, public humiliation, like time in the stocks or pillory, where you'd be physically restrained in a public square while villagers threw rotten food, insults, or worse. Corporal punishment, such as flogging, and in more serious cases, mutilation or execution. Poaching game from the lord's forest, even catching a rabbit to feed a starving family, could be treated as a serious offense, sometimes punishable by severe physical penalties, reflecting just how fiercely property rights were protected for the wealthy, while basic survival needs of the poor were treated as secondary or outright criminal. Nobility, by contrast, were typically subject to entirely different legal structures, often judged by their peers rather than local manor courts, and generally facing far lighter consequences for equivalent offenses. A legal double standard baked directly into the structure of feudal society, reinforcing at every level, from breakfast to birth to burial to courtroom, that the 99% and the 1% were, quite literally, everything we've walked through so far describes roughly a spring, summer, or autumn day, the growing and harvest seasons. But winter deserves its own attention, because it transformed daily peasant survival into something closer to a mathematical gamble. With no refrigeration, food preservation for winter relied entirely on salting, smoking, drying, and root cellar storage, techniques that worked, but imperfectly, and were entirely dependent on how successful the previous harvest had been. A bad harvest year, caused by drought, flooding, an early frost, or crop disease, didn't just mean less food for a few weeks. It meant potential starvation stretched across the entire winter and into early spring, before the next planting cycle could even begin producing food again. Livestock, too, faced a brutal calculation each autumn. Many peasant families couldn't afford to feed their entire herd through the winter months, meaning a significant portion of animals were slaughtered in autumn, specifically because there wasn't enough stored feed to keep them alive until spring grazing returned. This meant a temporary abundance of meat in autumn, followed by months of scarcity, as the surviving animals were kept alive purely for breeding, milk, or labor purposes rather than food. Winter also meant shorter working daylight hours, but paradoxically, more physically taxing survival demands, gathering and rationing firewood, keeping livestock alive in freezing conditions, managing the very real risk of hypothermia in poorly insulated homes, and stretching food stores across months with no guarantee they'd actually last until spring. Malnutrition-related illness spiked during these months, and historical records show clear seasonal patterns in mortality, with late winter and early spring representing the most dangerous period for peasant communities each year, precisely when stored food reserves ran lowest and bodies were most weakened from months of reduced caloric intake. Once again, the wealthy experienced winter completely differently. Manors had the storage capacity, the imported goods, and the financial resources to weather bad harvests without existential risk. A poor harvest might mean the lord ate slightly less variety at his table, while for the peasant families working his land, that same poor harvest could mean the literal difference between survival and starvation for their children. I don't want to leave you thinking peasant life was purely, unrelentingly grim with zero moments of relief, because that wouldn't be historically honest either. Medieval peasants did find moments of community, celebration, and even genuine joy. They simply existed within a far narrower window than what the nobility enjoyed. Church holidays, which occurred with real frequency throughout the medieval calendar, provided rare mandatory rest days from labor, often accompanied by community feasting, however modest, games, dancing, and storytelling. Village fairs, seasonal festivals tied to harvest or planting cycles, and events like Midday brought genuine communal celebration, music, and rare access to meat, better ale, and simple entertainment like traveling performers, jugglers, or musicians passing through. These moments mattered enormously, precisely because they were so rare, standing out sharply against the relentless backdrop of daily labor. But even here, the class divide persisted. Nobility enjoyed leisure as a near-daily reality: hunting, music, literature, elaborate feasts, tournaments, while for peasants, leisure was a handful of scattered days scraped out of an otherwise unbroken cycle of labor, stretching from childhood until physical collapse. So let's take the entire picture we've built across this video and lay it side by side, one final time. The 99% of medieval Europeans lived lives defined by dawn to dusk physical labor that permanently damaged their bodies by their 20s and 30s. Chronic malnutrition, punctuated by genuine, recurring famine risk. Medical treatment that frequently caused more harm than the underlying illness. A complete absence of sanitation infrastructure that made waterborne and airborne disease a constant companion. Legal bondage to land and lord that eliminated the option of simply leaving a bad situation. A justice system stacked structurally against them. And hanging over every single one of these hardships, the recurring, terrifying threat of pandemic disease capable of erasing 30 to 60% of their entire community within months, with absolutely no understanding of why it was happening or how to stop it. The 1%, meanwhile, lived in the same centuries, under the same sky, often less than a mile away, with stone walls, real beds, varied and abundant food, actual leisure time, legal protection, educational access, and, when disease swept through, the meaningful, life-saving option to simply leave. That gap is the actual, filthy truth of medieval life. Not just the dirt floors, the disease, or the leeches, but the sheer, deliberately constructed inequality that shaped who got to survive comfortably and who was expected to sacrifice their body, their health, and often their life, simply to keep that comfort funded. Now, I told you at the start of this video that we'd get to the single most physically demanding, most disgusting, and honestly most lucrative medieval job that had absolutely nothing to do with farming. I didn't forget. I'm saving it, because it deserves its own full deep dive, and trust me, once you hear what it involved and what it paid relative to everything else we just covered, you will understand exactly why some peasants voluntarily chose this profession over farming, disease risk and all. That video is live right now, right here on this channel, and it picks up exactly where this one leaves off, walking you through the medieval jobs, so grim, so strange, and so surprisingly essential to daily life that most history classes never even mention them. Click it, because once you see what medieval society considered a respectable trade, you'll never look at modern job complaints the same way again. And if this video opened your eyes to just how brutal, unequal, and precarious life really was for the overwhelming majority of people throughout history, subscribe, because we're going deeper into the hidden, unglamorous, and often deliberately erased history of ordinary people, all the way from the ancient world to the industrial age. The peasants may have lost their names to history. They don't have to lose their story to us.